Thank you for joining us this late in the afternoon. I know that there are other things to be done out here that are quite inviting, so thank you for sticking with us. I wanted to start out thanking Equinix for sponsoring this particular session. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, Jim.
I'm not going to cut them any slack, though, just because of that. I can trust
you shouldn't.
Trust me. Our panelists today are participating from Japan, Sadayuki Abeta, who's Vice President, General Manager of Radio Access Network Development for NTT DOCOMO. Most of you realize that DOCOMO's amongst the top 5 largest telcos on the planet in terms of revenue, so he's a biggie. We've got Robert Pepper here. We'll make a parenthetical note. Those of you who have worked with Bob when he used to be back at the FCC often called him Pepper. There are two kinds of people in the world who cannot call him Pepper. One of them is people from the UK, which I am not. Dean is. And the other is people who went to Catholic school. So I just can't get those words to come out of my mouth. So when I see him, I have to call Bob. He sometimes doesn't realize someone's trying to talk to him. So thank you for joining us, Bob. Also, our final panelist is Jim Poole, who's the Vice President with Business Development for Equinix, and a guy who's really knowledgeable and very entertaining. I think you'll enjoy anything he has to say. What I wanted to start out with, because we didn't pre-plan actual questions, is to ask Bob to give us a walking tour of how we got to where we are today, that we're actually talking about open and virtual being the future of our entire industry. So Bob?
Yeah, thanks, Gary, and thanks for being here. We're back, at least some of us. So there's a technology trend. The way I think about this is this trend towards disaggregated, open, interoperable technologies is just the next step in a technology trend that began about 40 years ago, right? In the 80s and 90s, the first step was analog to digital. And then in the 2000, maybe starting 2005 or the 2000 teens, it went from hardware to software. So it was hardware and then not just software, but we began to look at things like SDN, virtualization, NFV. This next step in this technology trend is from integrated and proprietary network technologies to disaggregated, interoperable, and open with open interfaces that allows for modularity. And this is not some sort of disjuncture. It's the next step in this technology trend from back in the 80s, where it was this sort of everything was analog and it was all provided by a single vendor for the entire stack that you bought. And just for putting it in context, in terms of the closed traditional network and the new open and disaggregated, if you took a look at vendors, we went from few and we're moving to many. Interfaces, from proprietary to open. In terms of the roadmap, and this is really important, it's sort of at the design stage, the design phase of what do I need in my network, right? It was vendor-led, right? In this open disaggregated technology model, it's operator-led. And the operator is not just the traditional operators. It's anybody who's building networks. They are sitting at the table at the design stage. And then in terms of resilience, you were vendor-dependent. And now you have, you can use the vendors, but you also have other choices. So you have improved resiliency from greater choice. And then, frankly, in terms of innovation, it was business as usual that we'd done for 70 years, 80 years. And now it's a faster and much more diverse innovation cycle. And we're now looking for networking technology, the type of innovation cycle that we've seen in compute for decades. And these are fundamental changes. And it started with the network operators wanting to reduce costs and have more control. but it's gone beyond that. So it's not just about CapEx. It's also about operational flexibility, and so you have some OpEx advantages. The networks are more intelligent, so it gives the network operators much more control through intelligence to manage their networks as well. And so what we're beginning to see are the other advantages and features that come with moving into this virtualized or disaggregated technology world. And it's similar to, with cloud and cloud services. Yep. All right, and if you think about cloud, Microsoft talks about cloudification of the network. Well, it is. And we can talk a little bit about maybe next, the telecom infra project and how and why we developed that, helped create that. And then, an NTT is, a member and, a partner, but almost all of the major network, we started this back in 2016 with about 20 or 30 companies. TIP, the Telecom Infra Project Foundation, now has hundreds of members, including almost all of the major network operators, all of them, major operators in Europe, from, Asia, from Africa, US operators, Latin America. But it also includes silicon companies, chip companies, Intel, Qualcomm, Broadcom, and others, as well as new OEMs that didn't exist before. So it's a new systems integrators, right? So we're creating a completely new development and supply chain ecosystem for networking technology. And this is just like the move from analog to digital. Back then, there were the analog providers that, oh, no, this is not going to work. Well, yeah, it works. This is inevitable. It's happening, right? It's not going to turn back. The only question is how fast is this shift in this technology trend to this disaggregated, open, interoperable model? How fast is this going to actually, become the dominant model? And it's on its way, and it's moving much more quickly than anybody anticipated. The shiny object here that everybody sort of reads about is Open RAN. But it's not just Open RAN, right? There's within TIP, there are project groups on open optical, open Wi-Fi.
Billing systems, OSS.
OSS systems, BSS systems. There's a solutions group for 5G, private 5G within TIP. So it's much more than that. And one of the keys, how do you make it work? Right? Testing and validation, because you have to test it but it's not proprietary testing. We now have within TIP 16 community labs around the world in Asia, Europe, Latin America, North America, and just within just in 2021, we added 5 new TIP labs, community labs in Indonesia, Taiwan, Peru, Brazil, and France. So again, this is a trend that's picking up a lot of momentum, and that's why this is not your father's network anymore, which is the title of the session.
So, Sadayuki, how much of what Dr. Pepper said, and that I will say, Dr. Pepper, is correct in your estimation, and what's most important about what he said?
First of all, sorry for joining from the on-site. I won't be at Hawaii, but due to the COVID-19, so I can't go. But really want to be there in person. So as the previous speaker mentioned that, latest trend and trend is openness. And so actually, DOCOMO already deploys the open network in commercial. So I briefly I would like to share the latest status in DOCOMO, how our open network is deployed. So first, DOCOMO want to create the new world, making people live much more convenient and comfortable to solve social issues. So for this purpose, we established 5G Open Partnership Program in February 2018, so 4 years ago, to create new services, solutions through the collaborating with the vertical partners, such as the medical, local government, automotive, construction, retail, so many. Actually, now is at 4,500 partners join this program. Of course, that this is different. Some partners are ready to provide a new service. Some partners just start the discussion. So, so we need to deploy the different type of deployment scenario. So for 4G or 3G, the main deployment scenario is the consumer services. So we deploy the flat network and provide the flat services. But so 5G era, we not only is a consumer service, but also we need to provide that. We want to provide that. Enterprise services are working with partners and solve the social issues. So in Open RAN, so we can select the best solution in the world. So we do not depend on specific vendors' roadmap or solutions. We can provide solution to our customer if someone in the world has the equipment or solutions. So we can minimize the risk by selecting we can shorten the time because traditional network, the single vendor provides everything. So we need to wait. But the open network, if that we have the open interface and some vendor has the solutions, we can use it. Actually, that in our network, we use the different vendor remote head, different vendor base station, and different vendor core network. So according to the deployment scenario, we use the different vendors already. And now the number of the base station exceed at 40,000, and the customer is more than 8 million. So I think that open network is now really work in the world, at least in our network. So we think that this is not only for DOCOMO. I think the other operator can do. So to this purpose, we created the Open RAN ecosystem, working with the partners such as the hardware vendor, Dell or HPE, a software vendor or hardware, the platform vendor, Red Hat, VMware, and WindRivers, to work with them, not only provide that virtualized RAN, but also sharing our experience or know-how to the other operators. So we believe that we can accelerate that open network in the world. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Now, Jim, how does open play for the world's largest data center provider by revenue? There's no question about that.
Yep. So as you were talking, and we were talking backstage before we came out here, it made me think, so the whole reason Equinix existed, or exists, is because open, disaggregated, interconnected is a physics problem as much as it is a technology problem, right? So if you think about the history of the terrestrial networks and even the mobile networks, where did all of that equipment sit? Where did all that fiber terminate? It terminated in their buildings, and it was connected only to them. And so, the internet, as we know, is a network of networks. Back then, it was not actually well set up to accommodate that. So you actually needed this idea of a multi-tenant data center that could handle the fact that this particular customer likes Cisco, and this one likes Juniper, and this one, but they all actually need to be on an internet exchange because the internet is a network of networks. And so I completely agree that this is a long-term trend. Yeah. And we've seen it play out, not just in the sense that now we are a very large real estate data center management entity all around the world in lots of different countries. It's actually even playing out in the things that we develop internally. So just to give you an example, in the early days of cloud, it was all over the top. This is what we were talking about, right? And that had certain limitations, right? That was cloud going after developers. But for cloud to really take off and to become what it's become, you had to accommodate private networking connected to public infrastructure. But the problem we had back then was an MPLS core for any given network sat in their building on the other side of town. And so the idea that they were going to put something other than an IP pop into our location struck them as odd. Now, looking back, that's a very quaint thing to say because they make massive amounts of money. I mean, the amount of interconnection that happens between networks and cloud companies in our facilities is just insane. And so, this sort of open and constantly disaggregating. And the other thing that would have happened back then was, I would go to, say, one of the incumbent operators, and I would say, okay, now that you want to do direct connect with hyperscaler who, we have a platform that we could actually make it possible for you to make this an SDN-driven, very fast experience. And the answer was no, because it's my network. And it's closed down, and I've been putting up NNIs for 100 years, and I know how to do this, so I'll do it. So they did it. Fast forward 10 years, and now pretty much every incumbent operator on the planet is on what we call Fabric, right? And the idea there is, of course, the fact that you don't know who your customer will want to communicate with at the end of the day. And so you have this highly dynamic, data centers are very dynamic environments. They are not big, static, connect somebody's house, connect your office building, kind of things. And so we have to be able to support physically the type of behavior that's happening upstack. I always joked with Bob that, we're layer 0, we're dirt. There's an interesting way that this plays out in our environment, and I agree, it's going to keep happening over and over again. I mean, back when we rolled out a good example would be when we rolled out our what we call Fabric now, we called it Cloud Exchange back then. The goal was to try to get all the operators to connect to it, and then our enterprise customers could pick which network they would ride. Doesn't that sound lovely? Every network said no. They thought that sounded horrible, right? Now they all sell their network services over the same platform. So open and fast drives revenue, not closed and slow, right? So great point.
One of the things I've been sort of astounded with looking back on our next generation architectures is when the global telecom industry decided to make IP its next generation network. I think initially most of us are thinking, oh, it's a technology decision, right? It's about how we move the bits around. I think what we have learned since then is we were entirely wrong. That layers changes the whole business model of the industry, right? So what do you think, Bob?
No, yes. And in fact, what's really interesting about what Jim said is, there's been this shift as a result of that with the traditional operators, the carriers going, finally, aha, right? And they took the pencil out of their eye. And that is when, probably 5 or 6 years ago, or it was after, that happened, but they came to us and said, look, you, with others, right, were able to change the server business with open compute platform for data center, right? Because, it used to be vendor-led, proprietary, it was too expensive, you wanted to do the white box, right? And so it was, we published reference designs and it dramatically changed that business for everybody, and everybody benefited. It was really interesting. They came to us and said, we're getting killed because, the equipment we're buying, it either is over-featured or under-featured. It's not what we want. It's too expensive, uses too much energy, and we have no say in the design, right? We're not part of setting specs, right? The vendors say, here, take it or leave it. And there's all these features, and so don't turn them on, but you're still going to have to pay for them, right? And so that is big, and I think they realized that because exactly the experience with using cloud, what you just described.
Right.
And it was at that point they said, can we do something within the networking technology ecosystem and supply chain to make it look more like compute, right?
Yes.
And so that was a big aha, right, for a lot of us, and for them, that is what really drove it and changed it. So for example, on Open RAN, a lot of that development was done, through TIP with Telefonica and Vodafone that are competitors in Europe, but they collaborated on the technology development and then brought in new vendors, new players to actually make this stuff. And so it became a more collaborative, process at the, technology development layer. And then they're going to compete the hell once they get that and compete in what they do in terms of services. And so the experience, I hadn't thought about it this way, but the experience you just described, I think, was really a tipping point for, let's put it, the CTO, the technology C-suite people at the telcos, and it was kind of like, what can we do to look more like the innovation cycle and the cost cycle and compute instead of our existing traditional, take it or leave it vendor lock-in, right? And that was a big, big shift.
Absolutely.
Sadayuki, DOCOMO, I think, was very early to understand that if a telecom network becomes a computer network, the way that we develop applications totally changes. Comment about that a little.
Yep. Yes, as talked before, we need to support various type of the services, not also need to support the different scenario. And some applications need to provide very short latency. And that's the case that we need to serve a call to that a site. For example, that the MEC server, multi-access edge computing is called to that the LAN side. So which sharing by that LAN node or core node or MEC node, we can provide very short latency services. So using that, common hardware, we can put on that any kind of services on that. And as the previous speaker mentioned that, some places the operators co-work with to reduce the cost of to accelerate provide new services. So our deployment side. Usually, traditional way that we provide LAN, we provide the core network, we provide by the data center. But now we share that the resource, LAN, core, data center, or make in the same place, or how we can manage the resource and provide the new service in short time. That is very important for us.
So we've got about a minute and 18 seconds left. I need a summary from someone about what is coming next. What do we need as service providers and infrastructure providers to really focus on in the next phase of our industry's development?
That's a pepper question.
So let me, so what needs to happen to accelerate this process? Let me just maybe change the question a little bit. By the way, NTT is a great partner. We have, because there's a policy component of this. And so, we and some others 2 years ago created something called the Open RAN Policy Coalition. It's about 60 companies now, including NTT. We have, there are 5 Japanese companies that are members of that, really active. There are, 2 carriers from India, as well as, technology companies. So the question is, how do we begin to accelerate? And there's some things that policymakers can do, but this is really going to be, has to be industry-led and driven. And it's about getting into the field. There are the commercial developments. There are the trials. The trials are leading into the commercial deployments. And one of the things that is actually very exciting, but it's a game changer, and that's the creation of new systems integrators. Because one of the things that traditional vendors do really, really well, right? And they do, they're systems integrators. right? What the network operators are not happy about is if I buy, the radio unit, I have to buy everything, right, up and down the stack. But, operators, many, especially the smaller ones, are saying, well, if I don't go to that vendor, who's going to actually help me put it all together, knit it together, deploy it, and maintain it, help me maintain it? What's really interesting is there's some companies that have been systems integrators in the IT space, but never in the networking space. And they are now getting into the networking space as systems integrators. And that, to me, is going to be the accelerant that will allow knitting together all of these pieces, not just for the self-provisioning companies that are great global companies like NTT or some of the big global companies, but there are all of the other operators that can't do it on their own. And that, to me, is going to be the real game changer that's going to just really accelerate this from a business side.
And that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, we're unfortunately out of time, so I have to call it to a close. But Dell, is that a name that people need to keep in mind?
Let's put it, Dell is a member of both TIP and the Open RAN Policy Coalition.
Okay.
And I let them talk about their own business model. But yeah, that to me was real interesting.
Okay. Thank you so much. Sadayuki, thank you for joining us.